Hello and welcome to Flying Legends 2003. We're at Duxford for one of the great events in the British Airshow season, and as always here, we've seen some wonderfully restored historic aircraft and some very exciting flying. But I'm afraid to say, it's also been a weekend of great sadness. There was a crash which killed 2 Navy airmen as they displayed a fairy Firefly, an aircraft we haven't seen at Legends before. Now, in all the years that we've been filming shows here and at other venues around the country, we've never seen a fatal crash, and the Red Admiral team has been very shocked by what happened. But the show did go on, and everybody here has been trying to put this terrible tragedy behind them. We'll have more to say on that crash later, but now let's look at some of the highlights of Flying Legends 2003. We'll see 2 immaculately restored Junkers Ju-52s, one over from France, the other from Germany. A British wartime hero is honoured at last by Belgium. We'll be following the Bristol Blenheim, one of Duxford's best known aircraft. Today it's had 2 of our cameras on board. And there's a Russian aircraft here. We'll be taking our first look at the old flying machine company's Lavochkin. We start though with a type that's much more familiar to Duxford visitors, the Spitfire. There's been a whole squadron of them on duty here over the weekend. They started the show on both days. To hear more about them, let's join Sean Maffett.
The first aircraft in this magnificent collection of Spitfires taxiing out there is a Mark 5B, F5B fighter version. It belongs to the fighter collection. It's one of the Merlin engine Spitfires, the smaller versions, and the Mark 5 was in fact the most numerous Mark of all the Spitfires. And this one is a Mark 9. It belongs to the Aircraft Restoration Company, and it's flown by Alan Walker. Another Merlin engine Spitfire. And this is a Mark 14, an FR-14, and it's flown by Stephen Gray. Now this is really his air show. Flying Legends was his inspiration, but of course it's run in conjunction with the Imperial War Museum. Another Griffon-engined Mark 14 here, also belonging to the fighter collection, and this one's flown by the great American warbird ace, Steve Hinton. A Mark 18 Spitfire now, another Griffon-engined version, flown by Jack Brown, and belonging to the Aircraft Restoration Company. And this is the Rolls-Royce owned PR-19, flown by Phil O'Dell, the Rolls-Royce chief test pilot, generally known as Pod. And here's another Mark 14, also belonging to the Aircraft Restoration Company, flown by John Romaine. And looking very similar, a Mark 16, but this one is a Merlin-engined aircraft, actually a Packard Merlin, also belonging to the Aircraft Restoration Company and flown by Rolf Meeum. So, as they all start their takeoff runs with the Merlin-engined aircraft on the grass and the Griffon engines on the runway, it's the opening of Flying Legends 2003. So here are 4 Merlin engine Spitfires in formation, flying over the historic airfield of Duxford, because of course Duxford was the first Royal Air Force airfield, the first operation airfield anywhere to take operational Spitfires. 19 Squadron received its first batch of them in August 1938. These are the big Griffon engined, and it's interesting here because we have a spread all the way through from Mark 5, Mark 9, 14, 16, 18 and 19, which gives some kind of indication of how much the Spitfire was able to develop and how much development room there was in R.J. Mitchell's extraordinary airframe. There's an interesting comparison between the performance of these aircraft over the years. The prototype in 1936 could fly at 342 miles an hour. The Mark 22 could fly at 450, more than 100 miles an hour faster. The engine power went from 990 horsepower to 2,375, and the size of the engine, the Merlin engine, was 27 litres, but the Griffon was 37 litres, and that was a really extraordinary range of development for any kind of airframe.
Well, the resident Duxford Spitfires appear at every Flying Legend show, but there's always something new for the crowds, and this year we welcome a beautifully restored Junkers Ju-52 on its first visit from France. It's not completely new to Britain. This aircraft was once based at Coventry, where it was used for film work. That was many years ago, and few would recognise it today. The Junkers was acquired by Jean Salis, who has a superb collection of historic aircraft at La Ferté-Alais, just south of Paris. More than 50 people worked on this restoration, and the standard could not be higher. It's been fitted out to represent a troop carrier, one of the many roles these aircraft had. The man in charge of the project was Robert Roget. He says that when he took it on, he didn't realise quite how much the Junkers had deteriorated. Today there are very few collectors who would invest in an aircraft of this size.
L'avion étant démonté, tout a été décapé.
We started taking it all apart, and that included stripping the whole aircraft down to the bare metal, inside and out. All the fuel systems, electrical systems, all systems relating to the airworthiness of the aircraft were remanufactured or repaired. So we also renovated all major structural components, all the engines, the propellers, everything had to be carefully checked, in some cases x-rayed, and made sure that it was safe and usable and tested. All the instrumentation is to the German standard or original. The only concession has been to modern communications equipment due to the safety requirements of flying nowadays.
So what's it like to fly this big transport aeroplane? Its systems are basic, as you'd expect for a type that first flew 70 years ago. For example, the gyros are driven by Venturis instead of a vacuum pump or electricity. And like most large tailwheel types, it can be tricky to handle on the ground.
It's heavy on the control, especially we need to use the rudder to put the aircraft in a turn because it's heavy on the aileron. It's very much difficulty to taxi on the ground because we have pneumatic brakes and we use the brakes through the power control aileron. The brake is not on the rudder pedals.
One of the interesting things about this splendid transport aircraft is that it started out as a single-engined aircraft that was found to be somewhat lacking in performance. So they just added an engine onto either wing, making it the Ju-52 3M, 3M for 3 motors. It first flew in 1932. This is the German aircraft. This one belongs to the Deutsche Lufthansa Berlin Stiftung Historische Flotte, the historic fleet of the Berlin Lufthansa Museum. There's Uwe Barstow, the pilot, on the left-hand side there, and we'll be able to see how difficult the thing actually is to control. Now you may notice that these aircraft are taking off in the opposite direction to the direction in which we saw the Spitfires. And that's because some of these pictures are taken on the Saturday and some on the Sunday, and the wind had changed, therefore the runway had changed. Now you can see them rocking the wings here, and if we go inside the cockpit you can see how much movement of the control wheel they have to make to do this fairly simple manoeuvre. In 1935, they actually produced a bomber version of this with a 3,300-pound bomb load and self-defense guns, and that actually equipped the first Luftwaffe bomber squadrons. They first came into operational use in Spain with the Legion Condor and the Nationalist Air Force. But the military transport version, and both of these are kitted out as military transports, remained in service on all fronts of the war until the German defeat in 1945. They're quite comparable to the DC-3 and of a similar sort of vintage, pretty much the same size. The silver German one from the Berlin Stiftung was bought in 1984 and completely restored by Lufthansa technicians. And here we see the pilot Uwe Barstow flying that aircraft. She came back into flying service again in April 1986. It was rechristened Berlin Tempelhof after one of the wartime Berlin airfields. Beautiful landing on the runway. Not allowed to land in the three-point position with all three wheels down at once, because the risk of losing directional control is too high. There, a beautiful landing on the grass, a little bouncing caused by the roughness in the grass. There they are, waving to the crowd, rapturously received. Probably the first time we've seen two Ju-52s fly together for a very long time. And keeping the German connection, this is the Bücker Jungmeister, the single-seat aerobatic trainer for the Luftwaffe. And in fact, these colours are the Luftwaffe aerobatic team of 1938. This actually first flew in 1935, and it's flown by the only woman pilot in the display today, Anna Walker. She won her first aerobatic competition in 1992 in the two-seat version of this, the Bücker Jungmann, and since then she's won 3 out of every 4 competitions that she's entered. Her one ambition at the moment is to fly the Fighter Collection P-47 Thunderbolt, and she's just waiting for the invitation to do that.
Now, of course, Duxford itself is an airfield with a rich wartime history. Many aces were based here, including the great Douglas Bader, who flew with both 19 and 242 squadrons. A little later, this man arrived. Roland Beaumont, known as B, commanded 609 Squadron flying Typhoons, a unit which at the time included many Belgian pilots who'd fled from Nazi occupation. B was a leading figure in the Typhoon test program, He helped its makers to overcome early problems with the type and later to develop its successful role of ground attack. Though wounded in combat, he survived the war to enjoy a long and distinguished career as a test pilot. And before the show, survivors from his old squadron gathered for a ceremony to honour his wartime service. B was posthumously awarded the Croix de Guerre, Belgium's gallantry medal. It was presented to his daughters by Lieutenant General Michel Donnet, himself a former Spitfire pilot who escaped from Belgium in a biplane to join the RAF.
Well, I knew Beeman quite well in 1942 and later too, I mean, because we came across each other. He was a very outstanding pilot and one of the most daring men I have seen, and in fact, really, did test some of the most advanced fighters and other aircraft like the TSR-2, for which he had spent a lot of time. And he was really outstanding because I think many other pilots would have not been able to come up to the same sort of level of flying than he did himself. I mean, so really one can say he was one of the best pilots of his time.
B had known he was to receive the medal, but his death in 2002 came before it could be presented. His family, though, have no doubt how he would have felt to be honoured in the presence of his squadron mascot.
It would have been his idea of a perfect day. He would have been so honoured to have been given this award by the Belgians, and he would have just had such a wonderful time being with his old friends as well.
Well, now it's time for a look at the big cats from the Grumman works. This is the twin-engine Tiger Cat, and because it's twin-engine, the fuselage can be very slim. Despite the fact that it looks as if it might not be very fast, it is extremely fast and extremely manoeuvrable, as we shall see. Here's the Bearcat, the last of the big piston-engine fighters from Grumman. And here's the Hellcat, an extremely successful fighter aircraft credited with destroying more than 6,000 Japanese aircraft, also supplied to the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. And this is the little Wildcat, which preceded all of them. Nonetheless, a very successful aircraft. So the Tiger Cat is the first to take off, flown by Pete Kinsey. The Hellcat is next, flown by Dave Southwood. And the Wildcat in the hands of Howard Pardew. And here's a splendid formation of all four of these cats, and they all belong to the fighter collection. And each one is the only one of its kind in Britain. Wildcat and Hellcat break away from the main formation and start a tail chase, a play dogfight. Now the Wildcat, the earlier of the two, first flew in 1937 at a maximum speed of 318 miles an hour. But the Hellcat, which didn't come in till June 1942, had a maximum speed of 380 miles an hour. And this actual Hellcat was the aircraft flown by the fourth highest scoring US naval ace of all time, Alex Vrashew. It's in his markings, and in this actual aircraft, he shot down 6 Japanese aircraft within 8 minutes. The earlier Wildcat, a very successful aircraft for its time, more than 7,300 of them built. And we're looking at the Tiger Cat now because I mentioned Alex Vrashu, the great Navy ace. After he'd finished with the Hellcat, he became the Navy's acceptance pilot for the Bearcat. One day he was out on a Bearcat flight and he saw a Tiger Cat below him.
Well, I was up, I don't know, by maybe 12, 13,000 feet, and I saw another plane down below, a Tiger Cat, and I thought what I would do would come on in underneath him and come up in front of him and do a slow roll, on the thing, just saying hello. Starting my run, coming down, I had the altitude and all the advantages that you're supposed to have. All of a sudden, I found myself in a dogfight with this other plane, the Tiger Cat, all the way down to the ground, and nobody would give, 1 inch, and it was just one roll right on in a vertical plane. Well, before I got caught into the thing, I had the altitude, and I should have been able to not let him turn into me or do anything, because I'd make my run and then pull back up again. I figured that a single engine plane and the Bearcat could beat any old plane out there, especially a twin engine plane. But I'll tell you, that pilot was good, and he handled that twin-engine Tiger Cat fantastically. So I got back to the squadron, and I called over to flight test, and I said, who in the world was flying that Tiger Cat? And they said, oh, that was Marion Carl, which a Marine fighter ace on there, and for years and years afterwards, I used to always say every time we'd have a joint appearance at some place or we'd be riding, I'd come on, Marion, admit that I shot you down. And he'd just make a little noise, on the thing, but he handled that plane beautifully.
Commander Alex Vrashu talking at his home in California when I met him a few months ago, and he's still very hale and hearty at the age of 83.
The Bristol Blenheim, one of Duxford's best-known aircraft and the only flying example in the world. Today's pilot is John Webb, here briefing his observer Ben Johnson as the ground crew primed the 2 Bristol Mercury engines. The Blenheim had many roles in World War II. It was operated by both Fighter Command and Bomber Command, but it was originally designed as a civilian aircraft. It was its speed which led the War Ministry to order a military version. The Blenheim is flying with 2 Hurricanes, as we shall see in a minute. On board are 2 of our cameras, so we're going to follow the display from the flight deck, and John will talk us through it.
The Blenheim is a very nice airplane to fly. It's very nice to control. It's a little bit heavy in controlling pitch for climbing and descending. Needs quite a lot of trimming, but apart from that, it's very good in crosswinds and very nice to fly. I've been flying it now since it first flew. And enjoy every minute of it, really. Just been cleared to take off. There's an aircraft above displaying and just starting to roll now. Power's on. Just correcting a little bit for some wind from the right. Even on the centre line of the runway. Tower's just coming up now. I'm just getting to climb speed, and there we go. Airplane's airborne. Just raising the undercarriage now. Keeping the aircraft quite low, about 50 to 80 feet. Because the aircraft's still displaying above us. The Hurricane that's going to form maiden us is taking off at the same time on the grass just to our left. So we come over the motorway at Duxford and make a very gentle left turn, keeping low and allowing the Hurricane to come up behind us and eventually form made up on our right hand side. So we're climbing away now. As we climb away, just setting climb power, checking the temperatures and pressures, making sure everything looks sensible. Putting carb heat on. And just waiting now for the Hurricane that took off with us to form up on the right hand side. We're also to be joined by Sea Hurricane, which will join us on our left hand side.
That's number 2 coming in from the left.
Look out for the black hurricane your side.
First aircraft with us. I can see the aircraft on my side already. So the formation is now formed. Holding speed at this stage with the Blenheims about 150 knots, 170 miles an hour. And as we run in for the display, that'll be going up to about 210 miles an hour with the formation. And in the wing overs, the speed reduces back to about 110, 120. You can see us now just commencing our display. Just coming over the M11 motorway, moving towards the centre of the airfield, and we're in a right banked turn so the crowd can see the top views of both the Hurricanes and the Blenheim itself. We go through the centre line now, and just rolling the wings level. Coming out to the western edge of the airfield. As we clear the airfield, slowly now start to raise the nose, keeping both Hurricanes with us. The nose comes up and speed starts to reduce. We just now start to turn towards the left. And looking over my left shoulder now, checking where the runway is so that I can see that. The wind today is actually blowing us in towards the crowd, so adjustments need to be made for that so we can keep our position correct. So I'm adjusting that, keeping the speed at the same time, making sure the formation's with me, and just checking the aircraft's good at the same time. You can see the runway now. Happy with my position. I'm just adjusting for the centre line. Running back in again, lower the nose. In the turn we've got to about 800 feet. Now we're coming down to 50. Speed is about 210, 220 miles per hour. Formation's tucked in one either side. Approaching the midpoint of the runway. At the midpoint I'm going to pull up. So I'll call that to the other two aircraft.
Rising brake, go!
And there I go, pulling up. So I've broken away and the other two aircraft have disappeared straight ahead underneath me. Once I see them go clear, I'm now rolling to the right and I'm going into the circuit now for a landing. So I've reduced power on the engines. I've put the propellers back into fine pitch for landing. That gives them the maximum power available in case we have to go around. And at the same time with the speed reducing, I've now lowered the undercarriage as well. As we come downwind, as well as checking my position, telling the tail where we are, what we're doing, and any aircraft that might be on the ground. I'm also checking that the undercarriage is down, checking the brakes, checking the fuel mixtures are in fully rich, checking the propellers have gone fully fine, checking the fuel is good, adjusting the flaps as required, and checking that we're both strapped in and secure for the landing. With all that done, now get on with flying the aeroplane again. Check our position. We're coming up towards the end of downwind now. There's 3 aircraft lined up on the grass, one waiting to line up on the hard runway, and we're turning right base now to land on the hard runway. So all I'm doing now is looking at my landing point, adjusting the power to adjust the height, and controlling the speed at the same time. As we come round right base to land on 06 on the tarmac runway, the wind is behind us. So it's actually going to blow us very slightly through the centre line. So as I roll out, there'll be a slight adjustment back onto the centre line, so we're in the right place. I'm coming round now, just selecting full landing flap. You can see the centre line of the runway there, just slightly to the left of it. I'm just slightly correcting back onto that now. And that's purely the wind behind was a little bit stronger than I'd allowed for and just pushed me through slightly. So coming in towards the runway now. Taking the power off, just checking the aircraft. A little bit of wind from the right. And there we go, she's down.
Well, the recent history of this Blenheim is well known. Its predecessor was involved in a serious crash. Its owners then embarked on another long restoration to produce this immaculate aircraft. But everything you see on the Duxford flight line owes its life to a team of restorers, often unpaid volunteers who've given a large part of their lives to keep it flying. Not far from Duxford is another important warbird base, Old Warden Airfield, and that's the home of the Shuttleworth collection, which has 3 aircraft here today. One of its restorers is Steve McManus. Retired now, he gives 3 days a week to the collection. Steve has been preparing this Sea Hurricane for its display, an aircraft he knows inside out, having helped to rebuild it. It was a task others had been reluctant to take on.
It's arrived literally like a giant airfix kit with no instructions. It had been totally stripped apart from the main structural framework. All the innards, all the systems were all in boxes and not labelled, of course, and we had to start from there.
How long did it take to restore it?
It took, well, in fact, it was 9 years, 9 months and 9 days. Someone actually took the trouble to work it out.
Over that period there must have been many thousands of hours. How did you go and work out how to put it together?
If you're a mechanical engineer, there's a certain amount of common sense. You could get the original APs, the manuals, so you worked from them, and we also went and had a look at 1 or 2 others.
Does it require constant maintenance? What needs most looking at?
It doesn't need a lot of maintenance if it's had the sort of overhaul that this one has, where it's been totally to pieces. I mean, most of these displays we come to, all we do is check the oil, check the coolant, tyre pressures, hydraulic levels, and that's it. And I've done that this morning in, half an hour. If it needs a little bit, we add it. But obviously in the winter it goes into a full maintenance programme where we strip off all the removable panels and have a darn good look at the aircraft. But in truth it doesn't need a lot of maintenance, not at the sort of time this one's flown from overhaul.
So we've seen the US naval aircraft, now it's the turn of the British naval aircraft, because this is the Sea Hurricane. And with it the Gloucester Gladiator, the sea version of this. This time with a radial engine as opposed to the inline engine of the Hurricane, the V12 Merlin in the Hurricane. And the Hawker Nimrod, which is a direct antecedent of the Hurricane. This is a naval version of the Hawker Fury. Three of them take off together. Gladiator bounding into the air in the colours of the Royal Norwegian Air Force. Got those colours for a film and it's never been changed since. And the Sea Hurricane gets off. You can see here its wide track undercarriage which folded inwards, unlike the Spitfires which folded outwards. And the 2 biplanes here, nearest the camera, the Nimrod with its sleek lines. Sleek because it had the inline V12 engine, the Rolls-Royce Kestrel, forerunner of the Merlin. Whereas the Gladiator had the Bristol Mercury 9-cylinder radial. These Hawker biplanes, forerunners of the Hurricane, were probably some of the most graceful and elegant aircraft of their time. This Nimrod, along with the heart and the hind, epitomised the style of the age. First flew in 1930. Later versions actually had slightly swept back wings and had a carrier deck arrestor gear. And here's the Gladiator, Gloucester Gladiator, sort of in between type of aircraft. Because it was a biplane, but it also had an enclosed cockpit, and it was supposed to be an updated version of the biplane. But it only first flew in 1936, whereas the Hurricane had already flown in 1935. So this aircraft was more or less obsolete when it started. But nonetheless, it performed valiantly in many important battles during the war. Now the Sea Hurricane. After the Battle of Britain, the Navy took on several of these aircraft, and it was first of all converted to be the Sea Hurricane 1A. They were often known as the Hurricat because they got catapulted from the front of merchant ships. They couldn't land back on the ship, so they had to ditch alongside the ship and hope they could be picked up, or they had to go back and land on the land. But fairly soon they developed the Sea Hurricane 1B, which is what this aircraft is, and it had catapult spools underneath and also a tail hook, so it could land back on the merchant aircraft carriers of the day.
There was another aircraft in this section of the show, a newly restored ferry Firefly of the Royal Navy Historic Flight. The Firefly was making its first appearance at Legends. It turned out to be a brief and tragic one. Its display started with a four-ship flypast leading the Gladiator, Sea Hurricane and Nimrod. At this stage, everything appeared to be normal. Later came the Firefly's solo slot, beginning with a run along the display line into a derry turn. The aircraft then returned in the opposite direction for what should have been another derry turn. But a few seconds after these pictures were taken, the pilot appeared to lose control in a steep right-hand bank. A recovery was almost complete when the Firefly struck rising ground in a wings level attitude. Flying was suspended while the Airfield Fire Service attended the crash site on the other side of the M11 motorway. Many people did not see the accident. Those that did realised at once it was not survivable. The Firefly was being flown by Lieutenant Commander Bill Merton, an experienced display pilot and instructor. Also on board was a ground crew member, Neil Ricks. Centre of gravity restrictions for this aircraft required that the rear seat was occupied. After some 40 minutes, the show was restarted, but for all those involved, the crash had cast a dark cloud over the day's proceedings. Those who take part in air shows know and accept the risks involved. We can at least be sure that the Firefly crew died doing what they loved and giving pleasure to thousands of people who'd come to see this beautiful aircraft.
Well, now for a unique group of aviators, the four pilots of the Breitling fighters. This is the P-40, the Kitty Hawk, flown by the doyen of the Warbird pilots and the owner of the old flying machine company, Ray Hanna. Here's the Spitfire Mark 9, flown by Nigel Lamb, very distinguished aircraft this. And here's the P-51 Mustang, Ferocious Frankie, flown by Lee Proudfoot. And bringing up the rear, the Corsair F4U, the only radial-engined aircraft in this formation, flown by Keith Skilling. And here they are, the four of them together in their beautifully tight, crisp formation, the Breitling fighters. Most people would say you can't do close formation work with aircraft that aren't of the same type. Here's the proof that you can. Three V12 engines. The Kitty Hawk has an Allison V12. The Spitfire and the Mustang have Merlin V12s. The Corsair has the radial engine. The Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp. Now, the second aircraft in this lineup at the moment is the Spitfire that I mentioned, MH434, perhaps the most famous of all Spitfires still flying today. Flown in combat by a South African pilot, Henry Lardner Burke, and with distinguished war record. Now, the Breitling fighters have been sponsored by the Breitling company for the past few years. Breitling has always been a great friend of the aviation world. Sad to say, this is the last year that they will be sponsored by Breitling, and we don't know yet whether they'll be able to continue in this format. Well, now something very different. Perhaps lacking in the grace of the aircraft we've just been seeing, but nonetheless an extremely effective aircraft. Surprisingly effective, some would say. It first flew in 1945. It wasn't in time for the Second World War. The Douglas AD-4 Sky Raider. By 1946 it more or less looked set for a peaceful and probably brief career as an old-fashioned piston-engined attack aircraft in the coming jet age. But as it turned out, the Sky Raider's career was anything but mundane. It put up an enormously exciting showing in the Korean War. It was a grand ground attack aircraft. And in squadron service with the US Navy and the Marine Corps, it gave excellent air support to the United Nations ground forces in Korea. It was designed as a torpedo and a dive bomber, with one enormous right radial engine, a right cyclone, 2,800 horsepower. But it also became an anti-submarine detection and strike aircraft. There were electronic countermeasures versions. There was an airborne early warning version with a big radome underneath. The Royal Navy had that version of the aircraft. And this particular aircraft belongs to the fighter collection and is flown by Paul Bonhomme.
Well, earlier we saw displays by the Gladiator and Sea Hurricane. Here's another aircraft from the Shuttleworth collection, and by far the most eccentric of the three, the Westland Lysander. The Lizzie had several wartime roles. It's best known for its secret flights into occupied Europe, supporting resistance forces and moving secret agents. Its peculiarities begin with the challenge of getting into it. That's quite an art in itself. Today it's being flown by Gordon McClymont, who's a test pilot on the Hawk and the new Eurofighter Typhoon. He first met this aircraft some 30 years ago.
When I was at school, I spent the summer holidays at Strathallan Museum because I was very interested in airplanes, and one of the airplanes was this very airframe here, when it was a complete stripped down, rebuild engine in the lot. So little did I imagine, sort of 30 odd years later, I'd be getting a chance to sort of fly in it now.
Now, obviously it's very different from the sort of aircraft which you normally fly. How did your chance come to fly this?
Well, I guess being a member of the Shuttleworth collection, which I have been for the last 12 or so years, and as you know, we got the airplane about four years ago, and it came along. It was just, like a lot of these things, it's a huge number of chance events that come along and manage to get to fly it. But flying it, it really was quite a surprise, because it's one of the few airplanes you actually take off, a tailwheel airplane, you take off in the 3-point attitude. You don't lift the tail and off you go. It's just power on and it goes up like a lift. And the first impression when you get airborne was just how not sloppy but very stiff the controls were. But having said that, the very stiff controls you think is a very unmanoeuvrable airplane, but it's not. It's very manoeuvrable, it's just very, very heavy.
Well, of course, the most famous role of the Lysander is that of spy taxi. picking up and dropping secret agents behind enemy lines. Now in that role, they were painted black like this one. They did have that long-range fuel tank underneath and the ladder on the side, so that the agent could easily get in and out. It's extraordinary to think that they would land in a field 250 yards long by 50 yards wide. And at night, most of these operations were at night, the field is marked with a red triangle of lights with a white one at the downwind apex of the landing area. And a white torch was used to flash the identification letter. I mean, the sort of things that could stop them would be the sudden arrival of Germans, which meant that if no lights were seen, then the pilot wouldn't land, and of course bad weather. There were 268 Lysander special sorties. 4 pilots were killed, 1 became a prisoner of war, and 4 escaped to Britain after crashes. 1,425 Lysanders were built by Westlands, and another 325 by National Steel Car in Toronto, so a total of 1,750 of these extraordinary aeroplanes.
Now this is something we haven't seen here for almost 60 years. A whole lineup of the checkerboard markings that characterized aircraft of the US 78th Fighter Group based at Duxford. This P-47 is familiar, of course. It's part of the fighter collection. Big Beautiful Doll is a frequent visitor to Duxford. This, though, is something new. It's a TF-51, a 2-seat Mustang over from America. And here's another P-51 which has recently joined the fighter collection. Twilight Tier was flown by a young American, Bill Davis, at the end of the war, and this is the original aircraft in its original colours. It was acquired from Sweden by Stephen Gray, and here for its Flying Legends debut are the family of its wartime pilot. They were tracked down in America and invited to Duxford to see it fly again. Like many veterans, Bill Davis never spoke much about his war service. He survived, claiming 3 kills, but died at the young age of 48.
I only really discovered one day just at my grandmother's house, his mother's, seeing a drawer full of medals, and asked my grandmother what was this all about. And she said, well, you know, your father was kind of a big deal in the Second World War, and I asked him about it. And, you know, he said, son, there's a reason that they send young men to war. And that was about really the only thing I can tell you that I ever recall him saying about it.
Twilight Tier arrived in reasonable condition, but stood in storage for a year before a minor restoration which saw it rewired and rehosed. And of course it had to be returned to its original paint scheme. The panel has been reworked to be as authentic as possible. For Louise Davis, this was very close to the view her father had in 1945.
All the dials are original. It has these cute little lights, the handles, everything about it is original. But I can't comprehend sitting in there for a couple of hours and having shots fired at you, bombs going off and everything in such a tiny little quarters. So to me, the whole thing is very amazing. And it seemed to be ahead of its time because there's a supercharger in there and it's just fantastic. But it really didn't come full circle until I sat in the cockpit.
Not quite such an original cockpit in this aircraft, the TF-51. In fact, it's got 2 cockpits, a training conversion carried out for the Bolivian Air Force. For the past 20 years, it's flown in the United States. It was brought here specially for the show, complete with its new checkerboard paint job.
It's one of the more famous, notable markings. You know, it's anonymous with Duxford, and it seemed appropriate, so that's the markings that were put on it. The airplane is owned by the Friedkin family, and they're you probably noticed their name pop up now and then, and they've been nice enough to bring it over here so people can enjoy it. That's what it's all about.
You know, most of the Mustangs have a jump seat in the back, and then some of the Mustangs, they put a little set of controls back there, but it's really kind of a hodgepodge. It's not really set up for training. And the TF has a full cockpit, obviously, in the front, and it's got the same cockpit in the back, so you can do quite a bit of good instruction with it. In the old days, when you were the 20-year-old kid who just got out of T6 instruction, they would take you out and stick you in the Mustang and stand on the side of the wing and slap you on the back of the head and say, good luck.
So here then, the checkerboard paint jobs that were once a common sight here at Duxford at the end of the Second World War. This is the P-47, the Jug, owned by the Fighter Collection, the biggest and most powerful piston-engined fighter of all time. Flying with it today, the 3 P-51s, the Mustangs. Ed Shipley flying the 2-seater. And here's Twilight Tear, which was incidentally named after a racehorse, and Rob Davis's Big Beautiful Doll, that's kept at a strip in Kent. And flying the Jug today, Stu Goldspink. Ed Shipley, one of America's top warbird display pilots. So here we have the 4-ship. The Mustang, one of the most numerous warbirds still to fly. Some 200 of them are still in airworthy condition around the world, mostly in America. That just shows you how rugged this aircraft was. Now let's look at the P-47. This was the aircraft operated by the first American fighter pilots posted to Britain in 1942. Equipped with drop tanks, it had the range to escort bombers deep into Germany. On the way back, it would adopt a ground attack role, strafing trains or military targets. One of those who flew the P-47 was Robert Rankin. He's been here at the show with other World War II fighter aces who've been signing books and photographs for visitors. Rankin shot down no less than 5 Messerschmitt 109s in a single sortie over Germany. The first of his kills dived straight into the ground with the P-47 in pursuit. Rankin almost suffered the same fate.
I got onto this one and he went into this steep dive. He couldn't outdive a P-47. It would go like a rock, but anyway, he was never able to pull out. We were always told that if a Me-109 was vertical at 5,000 feet, he wasn't going to make it. Well, it saved my life watching him because his airplane started to flutter. And I thought, uh-oh, and I looked, I was indicating 575, and my stick felt like it was in concrete. You know, I got both hands on. I was strong in those days. I pulled back with both hands and just brushed the tops of the trees, and my altimeter was still around 1,500 feet.
Well, of course, the aircraft that the P-51s and the P-47s used regularly to escort was the B-17, the Flying Fortress. And this is the only one flying in England, Sally B. Probably one of the United States' most important warbirds of the Second World War. And here we are on the flight deck with Captain Andrew Dixon and his crew. Sally B flies in the colours of Memphis Belle, the first B-17 to complete 25 missions over Europe. This actual aircraft was made by Lockheed Vega in Burbank, California in 1944. The war ended before she was ready for operations. She was used for weather research in America and in France, and bought by Ted White for Duxford in 1975. Flying here with the bomb doors open, bomb bay capable of carrying a normal load of 6,000 pounds, but could be up to 12,800 pounds, not as much as the Lancaster. Now look here at how much effort the crew has to make for a turn, and imagine how difficult that would make it if you were trying to avoid fighters attacking you. She has a plaque in her radio compartment which says that she flies as a memorial to the memory of the 79,000 US airmen who lost their lives in Europe during the Second World War. Of course, flying an aircraft like this and keeping her operational is extraordinarily expensive. She is now a registered charity, and she's operated by an amazing woman of aviation, Ellie Sallingboe, and in fact Sally B is named after Ellie Sallingboe. If this aircraft is to continue to fly in this country and not be sold to America, she needs the support of every one of us. So if you're at all keen to see this magnificent sight at shows in this country, then I do urge you to contribute to the Sally B Trust. Well, now we go to look at a second P-40 Kitty Hawk aircraft. This one belongs to the fighter collection. It's Tiger nose art, and it's flown by Nick Gray. It's flying with two other aircraft, which you might not think have much connection with each other than they all operated on the Eastern Front, on the Russian front. And this aircraft, of course, is Russian. It's a Yak-3, and it's flown by Mark Matthys. And finally, the B-25 Mitchell of the Duke of Brabant Air Force, flown by René van Hemert and Hans Delaveau. You see the extraordinary asymmetric undercarriage retraction of the P-40. And then the B-25 Mitchell gets airborne. Extraordinary aeroplane, the Mitchell, named in honour of Colonel Billy Mitchell, fearless US Army Air Corps officer, who was actually court-martialed in 1924 for his rather tiresome insistence on the importance of air power. B-25 was designed and built by a company that had no experience of twin-engined aircraft, no experience of bombers, or indeed of high-performance aeroplanes at all. But this was actually built in greater numbers than any other US twin-engined aircraft. Nearly 10,000 of them. The B-25 perhaps most famous for an extraordinary raid carried out by 16 of them, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, with a daring and morale-raising raid on Tokyo after they'd all taken off from the aircraft carrier Hornet some 800 miles away. Amazingly tough, these aeroplanes could soak up punishment and still get home. The P-40 Kitty Hawk, made by Curtiss, started developing these aircraft back in 1934. Like the Spitfire and Hurricane, they had a V12 liquid-cooled engine, this one made by Allison. And it wasn't supercharged, which meant that these never actually turned into very good fighter aircraft at height. But they were very good ground attack aircraft. 13,783 of these were built. So that tells you that they were good at what they were designed for. The Yak-3, quite an extraordinary airplane. When the Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev design team launched the prototype Yak-1, they referred to it as beauty. And these are elegant aeroplanes, streamlined, graceful, agile, and indeed deadly in combat. The Yak-3 was a development of the Yak-1, entered service in 1943. At low level, it could outturn any German fighter. And in fact, the Soviet female pilot, Lilia Litvak, shot down 13 German aircraft in 66 separate engagements.
Parked beside the Yak on the flight line before the show was an aircraft we haven't seen here before, another Russian type, the rare Lavochkin LA-9. Recently acquired by the old flying machine company, it arrived at Duxford in a freight container in June. It's since been to Paris to appear on static display. Here, though, it's flying, and there's no doubt that many people have come specially to see it.
This is a wonderful airplane. It was built in 1946, so it was at the peak of the Russian development of piston airplanes, piston engine fighters, and this airplane flew for the Russian Air Force and then went to the Chinese Air Force in the late 40s and subsequently ended up in a museum in Beijing. And Ray Hanna, after many years of negotiations, managed to procure the airplane, and it's been rebuilt in New Zealand to the standard you see today. It was the smallest airplane, the most manoeuvrable airplane that could put around a very large motor, 1850 horsepower motor, and it has 4 very big cannons. You can just see them at the front there. They're fitted, and they're .23mm cannons, so they're very big cannons, and was purely a fighter.
Now, of course, most of the aircraft you fly, warbirds, are American or British types, and there's a lot of commonality between cockpit details and the way controls are laid out, instruments and everything. Is this very different?
It is different in that it's very basic, and everything works really well. There's nothing electronic in the aeroplane. It's all manual gills, manual controls, so nothing much can break. So it's a very good, reliable, sturdy airplane from that point of view, but it's not as refined as the American and English fighters. But it was built for a purpose, and it served that purpose extremely well.
So Keith gets ready to fly his first display in the Lavochkin LA-9. It's the only one in the world in flying condition. Though there is in fact another Lavochkin, an LA-11, under restoration here at Duxford with the fighter collection. Someday perhaps we'll see them both fly together. Keith himself is an all-action man, a former pilot with the New Zealand Air Force. He's flown all sorts of types. He has his own Harvard back home. He's also a 767 captain with Air New Zealand. That presumably is how he manages to come to England every year to fly at the Flying Legends show. So let's just listen to the growl of this 1850 horsepower engine on the Lavochkin as Keith gets airborne. Gentle climb out to the west. You can see the American Air Museum there in the background. Now, at the time of the show, not even Ray Hanna had flown the Lavochkin. I'm sure, though, it won't be long before that most experienced of old flying machine company pilots has a go. And I shouldn't think it'll be much longer than that before they bring this aircraft up against the Bearcat, perhaps to see how they fare against each other. More than 1,600 Lavochkins were built. Of course, it didn't go into service in time for the Second World War. It was 1946 when the type flew for the first time. But it did go to China and North Korea in large numbers. It was involved in the early fighting in the Korean War. In fact, on several occasions, it was involved in combat with Sabre jets. The secret of this aircraft, of course, is a very big engine on a very small airframe, much like the Bearcat. And Keith himself was involved in the test program back in New Zealand, which is where the aircraft was restored.
We carried out 12 hours of test flying in New Zealand in the aeroplane. I did half the test flying. A mate of mine, John Lamont, did the other half. And it performs. And what you're really after is performance. And I mean, all the Russian airplanes I've flown, from the Polikarpov, I-16s, they were way ahead of their time. 1932 design, they were way ahead of the Hurricane and so on. And this aeroplane is really the end of that line, and they've always performed very well. And I understand that towards the end of World War II, the Lavochkin LA-5s and 7s, the earlier model of this, towards the end of the war, the German pilots were told to keep away. They were just too good below 15,000 feet. So it's a serious aeroplane. I haven't compared it with a Bearcat or a Seafarer yet because we haven't had the full power available, the engine's still being run in, so we're looking after the motor, not using too much power at the moment, but within 10 or so hours we should have full power, and I expect the airplane to perform extremely well. I mean, right now, even at cruise power, it's doing much, much better than most of the airplanes here. This airplane will cruise at 300 knots quite easily, so it's a very fast airplane.
Keith Skilling in the Lavochkin LA-9. Well, unfortunately for all those people who come to see the Lavochkin, it only appeared on the Saturday of the show. A minor technical problem kept it grounded on Sunday. But it's no doubt an aircraft we will see here for many years to come. I certainly hope so.
Well, now every Flying Legends air show ends with the most amazing grand finale. This is the start of the Balbo, and all of the aeroplanes that are capable of taking part in this part of the show get airborne, and they're all going to fly by together. No other air show in Britain does this. And there are not all that many places in the world where you could see so many warbirds flying together in formation. So let's just watch and listen as they get their act together. And suddenly the flight line that's been full of aircraft for the rest of the show is empty. But getting all of those aircraft together into a formation actually takes quite a while. And to keep us entertained while that's happening, Stephen Gray takes off in his FR-14 Spitfire. He's the owner of the fighter collection, and this is at least partially his air show. But if you look carefully, you'll see that one of the undercarriage wheels of the Spitfire hasn't retracted properly. Now, he's obviously not aware of that. If he were, he wouldn't be continuing with this demonstration. So lots of people call him on the radio. The air traffic control tower at Duxford calls him. Other aircraft call him. But one of the things about this aircraft is it's very, very noisy inside, and obviously he doesn't hear. So Frank Marson, the chief air traffic officer, fires a red Veery to warn him that there's something wrong with his aircraft. But Stephen is too busy doing aerobatics and doesn't see, and he continues doing his aerobatics with that right wheel still partially down. Meanwhile, the P-40 flown by Ray Hanna has to land and not take part in the Balbo because he has a minor technical problem. But there is the Balbo, led by Pete Kinsey in the Tiger Cat. The Cats at the front, followed by Spitfires, followed by Sky Raider, Corsair, P-47 and Yak-3. P-51s after them. The Breitling fighters follow them. More Spitfires, and then 3 Hurricanes and another P-40. Finally, Stephen Gray lands. Fortunately, there's no damage from the wheel that wouldn't retract. On the second time round, the formation starts to break up. The sections come in individually with run-in and breaks so that the aircraft can be sufficiently separated to land in stream. Spitfires here. Hurricanes here. The Cats. Pete Kinsey leading the break. And as he turns steeply downwind, you see his undercarriage come down in preparation for landing. And as they land, it's worth bearing in mind that Duxford does not have a formal air traffic control setup. They're merely flight information and safety officers in the tower. So really this is all organised by the pilots, who talk to each other, and they have to make sure that they don't get in each other's way. And the early landers have to make sure they go on down to the end of the runway, the end of the grass runway, before turning, because they don't really know who's behind them. And landing from this direction, that grass runway is quite rough, and you can often catch a bad bounce just as you put the aircraft down. It's all a remarkable tribute to the skill of these pilots, who don't get the chance to practice this. They just brief it very thoroughly, and they go over and over it again. And Hurricane catching those bounces, but of course Hurricane was particularly good in its ground handling. And always the perfect colours of an English summer's day. One of the things that 2003 will be remembered for was the weather that allowed air shows like Flying Legends to take place in such brilliant conditions. Setting off the wonderful paint schemes and the immaculate finish on these much treasured old aeroplanes. And there's Alex Vrashu's Hellcat. The amazing Sky Raider, kicking up the dust on the grass. And indeed, that red Veery has actually set some of the airfield on fire. And here's a glimpse of the P-47 Thunderbolt. A huge aeroplane for a single engine. The P-51s slink back into line, and the crowd love it. It is the most fantastic ending to an air show, and they all want to applaud Stephen Gray, the man who made Flying Legends possible.
Well, that's about it on a weekend that was, of course, overshadowed by that terrible accident yesterday. That's now under investigation, and a full report will be published in due course. But I think we can be sure that whatever the outcome, it won't affect the Flying Legends show, which will go ahead next year as planned. And if you're watching this at home and you've never been to Duxford, you really should try and come to Flying Legends, because even our pictures can't do justice to this wonderful spectacle of historic aviation. So for now, from all of us on the Red Admiral team, it's goodbye from Duxford.
Shortly after we filmed this air show, the Bristol Blenheim had a serious accident. It suffered an engine failure on final approach to Duxford, and it landed just short of the runway. The undercarriage collapsed. John Webb was flying it, and he was unhurt. The latest news is that the aeroplane will be repaired, but its owners say that it may be 3 years before we see it fly again.